The first time she saw the house, it didn't feel real. It stood at the end of a quiet street lined with trees whose branches arched overhead like a cathedral ceiling. The afternoon light spilled through the leaves, scattering golden patterns across the driveway. The front gate swung open with the slow elegance of something that had been oiled 1,000 times, and beyond it, the house waited. White walls, tall windows, the kind of porch you only ever saw in magazines. Her social worker had told her to expect something nice, but this wasn't just nice. This was the kind of place where people had family portraits framed in gold, where they drank tea from delicate porcelain cups instead of mugs. She felt the weight of her worn backpack against her shoulder and wondered if it looked as out of place as she felt. They were waiting for her on the porch. The couple, both smiling, both dressed in muted, elegant colors that matched without trying too hard. The woman's hair was pulled back into a soft bun, her eyes warm and assessing at the same time. The man had that kind of posture you didn't learn in school. It was in the way he stood, like someone who always knew exactly where he belonged. Imagine living a life where every smile around you hides a secret, and every person you trust might be playing a role. If you want to know where this story leads, make sure you subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you found out your family had a contract on you? Welcome home, the woman said, her voice gentle but carrying an undercurrent of authority. Home. She had heard the word before, in different houses, with different families, but it had never settled inside her the way it did now. Maybe it was the way they looked at her, as if she was already theirs, or maybe it was because this time she wanted to believe it. Inside, everything smelled faintly of vanilla and polished wood. The floors gleamed, the walls were lined with paintings of soft landscapes, and there was a piano in the corner of the living room. Real, not one of those decorative ones people put in for show. A fire crackled in the fireplace even though it was only autumn, filling the room with a gentle warmth. They gave her a tour, moving through each room with the ease of people showing off something they were proud of. Her bedroom, hers, was upstairs at the end of the hall. The bed was made with crisp white sheets and a thick quilt in soft blues and grays. There was a bookshelf already filled with novels, as if they had known exactly what she liked to read. On the desk sat a vase of fresh flowers, their scent light and sweet. "We hope you'll feel safe here," the woman said, standing in the doorway. "You have everything you need." Everything. The word settled heavily in her chest. She thought of the places she had been before, rooms with peeling wallpaper, beds with springs that dug into her back, houses where she was tolerated rather than welcomed. This was different, too different. At dinner, the table was set with silverware that caught the light from the chandelier overhead. They served roasted chicken, buttery potatoes, vegetables arranged like something from a cooking show. The conversation was polite, warm even, but it was clear they were watching her as closely as she was watching them. Every question they asked felt like a thread pulling her into their world. What music she liked, what her favorite subjects were, what dreams she had for the future. She answered carefully, testing the waters, but part of her wanted to give them everything, because maybe if she did, they'd never let her go. That night, lying in her new bed, she stared at the ceiling and tried to convince herself that she had finally found it. The place where she could stop running, stop worrying, stop waiting for the ground to vanish beneath her feet. Still, there was something in the way the woman had smiled just a fraction too slowly when she mentioned wanting to go to university. Something in the way the man's eyes had flickered when she said she liked exploring places she wasn't supposed to. It was nothing. She told herself it was nothing, but she kept thinking about the way they had looked at her on the porch. Warm, yes, but also measuring. Like they were making sure she was exactly what they had been looking for. The first weeks in the new house felt like stepping into a life she had only ever watched from a distance. Every morning, the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the kitchen before the sun was even fully up. The woman, she had started calling her mom almost without realizing, would place a glass of fresh orange juice at her spot on the table before she came downstairs. The man, Dad, read the newspaper in silence, occasionally looking over the top of it to ask if she had slept well. School was different now. She was driven in a sleek black car instead of taking the bus. She carried a lunch neatly packed in a bento-style box, each compartment filled with colorful, perfectly arranged food. People noticed. Friends she never had before began to appear, curious about the girl who had suddenly become part of one of the most respected families in the district. Teachers paid her more attention, as if her value had somehow increased overnight. She tried to ignore how quickly people's attitudes changed once they thought she belonged to wealth. She told herself it didn't matter. She had a home now. She had parents who seemed to care. That was enough. But slowly, small details began to whisper that something in this perfect picture wasn't as natural as it looked. It was in the way Mom always asked about her grades, not out of casual interest, but with an intensity that made it clear failure wasn't an option. If she got a B instead of an A, the smile at dinner would be just a little tighter, the conversation a little shorter. It was in the way Dad would sometimes pause in the middle of reading and ask questions about her friends, where they lived, what their parents did, how much time she spent with them. His tone was never harsh, but it was probing, collecting details as if he was adding pieces to a puzzle only he could see. Then there were the locked doors, one at the end of the upstairs hallway, one in the study. The first time she reached for the study door, Mom appeared seemingly out of nowhere, her voice gentle but firm. "That's private, nothing for you in there." The smile never left her face, but the warmth had vanished from her eyes for just a second. Still, for every strange moment, there were 10 that felt warm and safe. They took her to the countryside one weekend just to breathe fresh air. They bought her clothes she had only ever seen in store windows. They asked about her dreams for the future with such genuine curiosity that it was easy to forget the occasional flicker of coldness beneath the surface. One rainy afternoon, she came home early from school after a power outage. The house was unusually quiet. She wandered through the hallway, her shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor. As she passed the study, she noticed something different. The door wasn't fully closed. She hesitated, every nerve in her body telling her not to push it open, but curiosity has a way of drowning out warnings. She reached for the handle. It moved easily. Inside, the air was different, cooler, smelling faintly of leather and old paper. Books lined the walls, their spines in pristine condition. On the large mahogany desk sat a stack of neatly organized folders, each labeled with a name. And there, halfway down the stack, she saw her own name printed in bold letters. Her breath caught and hovering, she could open it, door opening through the hall, how close she had. But she couldn't stop noticing how they looked at her, like they were waiting for something. It was 2 weeks before she found herself alone in the house again. The timing was almost cinematic. Her parents had gone to an unexpected charity luncheon, the housekeeper had the day off, and the gardener's truck had disappeared down the long driveway hours earlier. For the first time since she arrived, the silence was absolute. She stood at the foot of the stairs, her eyes drawn upward toward the study. That file with her name on it had been haunting her thoughts like an unfinished sentence. Every time she tried to push it away, her mind pulled it back. What could they possibly have written about her? Why was it locked away with other files? This time there would be no interruption. She walked upstairs, her heart already picking up speed, and found the study door unlocked again. It was almost as if it was waiting for her. The air inside felt heavier, like the weight of every secret in the room pressed down on her shoulders. She crossed to the desk, her steps quick and deliberate, and pulled her folder from the stack. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first page was a copy of her birth certificate, something she hadn't seen in years. Below it were adoption papers, only these were nothing like the ones she had imagined. The language was cold, transactional, the kind of legal writing that stripped away any pretense of warmth. It wasn't about building a family. It was about terms, clauses, and conditions. She flipped through page after page, her eyes catching on words that made her stomach twist. Compensation, termination, renewal period. There were references to a contract between her adoptive parents and an entity she didn't recognize, a company name buried in legal jargon. But it was the handwritten note tucked between 2 pages that froze her completely. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was her mother's. "We need to ensure she fulfills her role before the deadline. If not, we return her. Return her," like she was a defective purchase. Her hands tightened on the paper, the edges digging into her skin. Her mind raced through every smile, every gesture, every moment that had felt like love. Had it all been rehearsed? Measured? Part of keeping her in place until... what? She found more. Detailed reports about her school performance, her health records, even notes about her behavior in social situations. There were photos too, not the kind you kept in family albums, but candid shots of her at school, walking home, talking to friends. Someone had been documenting her life in meticulous detail. A sound from the hallway made her freeze. The floor creaked, the kind of sound you only noticed in a house this quiet. She shoved the papers back into the folder, her fingers fumbling in her urgency, and placed it exactly where she'd found it. The creaking grew louder, closer. She slipped out of the study and pulled the door shut, trying to keep her breathing steady. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, Dad was in the foyer, setting down his keys. He smiled when he saw her, but it was different this time. More like a mirror reflecting what she expected to see rather than something real. "You're home early," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Change of plans," he replied. "We'll talk over dinner." Something about the way he said it made her skin prickle. She knew then that whatever was in that contract wasn't just about her past, it was about her future, and they weren't planning to keep it hidden much longer. Dinner that night was quiet in a way that made every sound sharper. The clink of cutlery against porcelain seemed too loud, the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway too deliberate. She barely tasted the food, perfectly seasoned salmon, roasted vegetables, rice fluffed like clouds, because all she could think about was the file in the study and the words burned into her memory. Return her. Her parents didn't speak much at first. Mom poured wine for herself and Dad without meeting her eyes, and Dad seemed more interested in cutting his food into precise, even bites than in eating it. It was Dad who broke the silence. "We've been thinking a lot about your future," he said, in that calm, measured tone that could have been either comforting or menacing depending on the context. "Opportunities are coming, but certain conditions have to be met." She felt her throat tighten. "Conditions?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Nothing you can't handle, just expectations, responsibilities. You'll understand soon enough." Her fork hovered over her plate, unmoving. The air felt heavy, like the entire room was pressing in on her. Mom reached across the table and placed her hand over hers, the gesture gentle, almost maternal, but her grip was firm. "We chose you," she said softly, "because we believed you could be part of something important. But you have to be ready to commit fully. No questions, no doubts." She didn't answer. She couldn't. Every instinct screamed at her to nod, to smile, to play along until she knew exactly what they were hiding. After dinner, she went to her room and locked the door, something she had never done before. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the faint floral pattern on the wallpaper, trying to steady her thoughts. The words in the file had felt cold on the page, but hearing their voices now, calm, pleasant, almost loving, made it worse. It was as if they believed every word they said was reasonable. She thought back to the subtle changes she'd noticed over the past month, the phone calls that stopped when she walked into the room, the packages that arrived and were taken straight to the study, the way both of them seemed more alert whenever she mentioned friends or plans outside the house. Something clicked then. This wasn't about her fitting into their family. It was about controlling every part of her life until whatever they were waiting for finally happened. The next day, she began watching them the way they had clearly been watching her. She memorized their routines, when they left for work, when the housekeeper came and went, which neighbors they spoke to and which they ignored. She noticed how Dad always kept his phone on him, but Mom often left hers in the kitchen, charging, a small vulnerability. One evening, she lingered in the hallway outside the kitchen just long enough to hear a fragment of their conversation. "The contract ends in 6 months, Mom said. "We'll have everything we need by then," Dad replied. "Just make sure she doesn't suspect anything." Her pulse pounded in her ears. 6 months. That was the deadline. She spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what would happen when the contract expired. Would they simply let her go, or would the truth be something much darker? She didn't know yet, but one thing was certain. If they thought she was just going to sit still and wait, they were wrong. From that night on, every smile she gave them was an act of theater. She played the role they expected. A grateful daughter, obedient, polite, but behind her eyes, something had shifted. Every word she spoke was calculated, every move deliberate. If they were going to watch her so closely, she would make sure they saw exactly what she wanted them to see. Her first goal was information. The contract was the center of everything, and she needed to know why it existed, who had signed it, and what would happen when it expired. But the study was too risky now. She couldn't return there without raising suspicion. So she turned to smaller clues. Papers left on the counter, letters tucked into drawers, overheard fragments of phone calls. One afternoon, while Mom was out shopping and Dad was in the garage, she found a thin envelope tucked between cookbooks in the kitchen. It wasn't addressed to either of them, but to a law firm she didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed line that made her blood run cold. Payment schedule for remaining term. 6 months remaining. That confirmed it. She wasn't just their daughter. She was part of a deal. The more she dug, the more unsettling the picture became. There were financial transactions that didn't make sense. Large sums of money moving in and out of accounts, often under vague labels like consulting or maintenance. She found out the company name listed in her file wasn't a company at all, but a trust. And the trust's sole asset, her. It was as if she had been assigned a value before she even stepped into this house. The knowledge burned inside her, but she couldn't let it show. Instead, she started testing them. She'd mention a new friend and watch their reactions. She'd talk about wanting to apply for programs abroad just to see the flicker of panic in their eyes. She kept her questions innocent but sharp, designed to make them slip even slightly. One night, she succeeded. Over dinner, she casually mentioned she had been looking at university scholarships overseas. Dad froze mid-bite, his fork hovering in the air. "That's unnecessary," he said quickly. "We've already made plans for your education here." She tilted her head, playing the curious daughter. "But what if I want something different?" His voice hardened, just for a second. Sometimes what you want isn't the priority. The air between them thickened, and she knew she was getting closer to the truth. But the more she pushed, the more the walls began to close in. The locked study door was now double locked. Mom had started keeping her phone with her at all times, and she began to notice people she didn't recognize. A man lingering across the street too long, a woman pretending to check her watch as she left the grocery store at the same time they did. They weren't just watching her inside the house, they were watching her everywhere. One rainy evening, she returned from school to find a sleek black car idling at the end of the driveway. The driver didn't look at her, but she felt his gaze follow her all the way to the front door. When she mentioned it at dinner, Dad brushed it off. "Probably lost," he said, but she could see it in his eyes. He knew exactly who it was. The 6-month deadline loomed over her like a storm cloud. Every day that passed brought her closer to whatever they had planned, and the tension in the house was becoming unbearable. The warmth in their voices felt thinner now, stretched over something sharp and dangerous. She knew she had to act before time ran out. But every possible move came with risk. If she confronted them outright, they could lock her away, or worse, if she ran, they could find her. And yet, deep down, she sensed there was someone out there who knew the truth. Someone connected to the contract, but not to them. The question was, could she find that person before the clock hit 0?